My name's Jorge. Today we're going to be talking about the life cycle of a table tortilla, which is the kernel to masa process. We're literally going to be taking raw corn and converting it into masa for a table tortilla. Things that you're going to need for today. For starters, for ingredients, all you're going to need is corn, water, and calcium hydroxide. The corn and the calcium hydroxide are available on Masienda.com if you want to go ahead and pick that up before you get started. For hardware today, you're going to need about a 10-inch stock pot with a colander for rinsing afterward, a mill of some kind. So in this case today, we're going to be working with molinito, which is also available on Masienda.com. This is a volcanic stone mill that you're definitely going to need to get that finesse of masa. Super, super important. You'll need a stand-up mixer of any kind. We're using a KitchenAid today. And finally a griddle, some kind of cooking place to be able to cook your tortillas with a press, which I should have said before the griddle, but you get the point. You'll do great. So with that in mind, let's get started. The goal of cooking is to soften the skins and the corn just enough so that it absorbs that alkaline solution that it's sitting in, and it can start to do its magic. In order to do this, we're going to measure out exactly 1% of the calcium hydroxide that we're using today to the weight of the corn that we're going to be cooking. So it's just about right. And then I'm going to start actually kind of making a slurry out of it. You know, you're going to end up filling the entire pot with water anyway. So this is really just to make sure it's kind of well incorporated and blends in nicely with a whole pot of water. Great, so at the end, it should kind of look like this milky substance. And then I'm gonna measure out a pound of corn. I'm gonna add the slurry directly to the pot. And then I'm gonna top it off with water. Make sure you have maybe like 2 to 3 inches of water above the corn level, giving yourself enough room for it to kind of expand, take on that water, but not be kind of out above the surface of the water later on. We're gonna bring this up to high heat. And once it starts to boil, take it down to medium temp so it can not too aggressively cook the corn. I haven't really been checking the time. The more important thing that I've been doing here is I've been constantly testing the corn to see how done it is. The two things I'm looking for are making sure that when I take a kernel and I rub it between my fingers, the skins are really easily coming off. And I'm also gonna check and taste a kernel, compare it to the one that I had in the very beginning. By this point, it should definitely start to bloom and smell and taste a little bit more like a finished tortilla. And the bite is definitely al dente. Again, it's not like powdery and gritty like that raw steak that we had it in, but it's definitely getting close to being like perfectly cooked. I could probably estimate that there's another 20% left of cooking, and that's gonna happen with just letting the heat turn off, and we're gonna let it soak for 8 to 12 hours. As I'm checking for the texture and the skins, I'm just gonna take some time to skim the surface and take off any unwanted kernels in the process. Any unwanted kernels are gonna float up to the top because they're a little less dense, so just take it off with a little strainer. All right, this is the time that we call nixtamalization. We're really just taking corn, letting it sit in an alkaline solution, and that's breaking down the corn to do a couple things for us. First, because it's alkaline, it's actually sterilizing the corn. It's also activating the corn's actual nutrients. Believe it or not, corn does have nutrients in it. Furthermore, the gelatinization that's happening in the cooking process. This is super critical to corn because corn does not have gluten. It needs a little bit of an advantage to be able to get to a point where it's binding and it's sticking in a tortilla, right? That sitting process is actually nixtamalization. There's not much to really see there, but there is a transformation. It's now time to rinse. We're gonna take a look and you can see already just how different this looks, right? I get up close to it. It's kind of sticky. It's a little slimy. I'm gonna transfer some of the corn over here and I'm gonna do a bit of a rinse. And as I do the rinse, what I'm looking for is understanding exactly what my wash off percentage is. How much of the skins are you taking off or how much are you leaving? In this case, I'd say if you're starting and you don't really know what you're looking for, do about a 50% wash off. Don't put too heavy of a trickle on the water. You want kind of a mild rinse. I can already see it's sort of a pulpy consistency coming off of my fingers. That's what I'm washing off, and I don't want to wash off too much of it. Okay, just show you what it looks like. Before we were starting with a really, really yellow kind of finished product, right? That's because the skins were still intact. They absorb a lot of that calcium hydroxide, which is when activated with water, yellow. So the rinsing is really important. Like I said, for the emulsification process, you're controlling the texture that you're working with by the amount of skins that you're either leaving or taking out. Further, you're controlling the color. We started with white corn. It definitely gets more yellow depending on the total amount of cal that you're using or the amount of cal and skins that you wash off. If you want a really bone white tortilla, you probably want to rinse off almost all those skins, because they definitely tend to absorb all of that color, and that is reflected in the final masa. One more thing you want to note, especially if you're using a molinito or any kind of volcanic stone, is that the more that you take off, the more the skins that you take off, the easier the machine is going to be to work. You can imagine kind of with that very gelatinous kind of sticky material, it definitely tends to clog up the augers and the stones a little bit more, and it takes a little bit longer to go through. So now that we've wrapped up nixtamalization and rinsing, the next step is to grind. This is Molinito. This is a 1 horsepower tabletop mill, which is the first of its kind. Key to this mill is that it's using volcanic stones. And the way these stones work is that you have one stationary stone and another one is spinning against it. As the stones pick up speed, over time, they're gonna get a lot of friction and a lot of heat. So I have this bathing in ice water, which really ensures that you're cooling it down before it gets to that point. So now that these have been soaking for 10 minutes, I'm gonna load these directly into Molinito. I have 2 pins here that are fastening this front hopper. So I'm just gonna remove them carefully. Yep, all right. And there's nothing inside right now. Each set of stones should have holes in the back that should match to the contours of these rods that are sticking out from the turning plate and from the front hopper. So I'm gonna stick this in, make sure it's matching, and be careful as you're setting it in not to drag it too much on the auger so it doesn't break. I think it's a little bit easier for the stone that's on the front to kind of mount it directly into these 2 rods that are coming off of the front hopper plate. Hold that in, kind of get your bearings on it, and just slide the whole thing in together, guiding the stone gently so it doesn't make too much friction on that auger. Once that's secure, I'm gonna hold it in place with the 2 fixing rods we used earlier. And Molinito's ready to go. In the back of Molinito, we have a tightening knob that's gonna control how close the stones are together. Obviously, the closer stones are together, the finer the masa is gonna be that comes off. The farther away they are from each other, the coarser it's gonna be. We're doing a table tortilla today, which means we're going for a really fine grind. In this case, like as close as the stones can get together without shutting the machine off, which is a really kind of a dance to the point where you feel you're dialed in. It might take a couple minutes to really understand how the machine feels. I'm just gonna give it a little squirt of water. I'm gonna be constantly making sure that the stones are being fed with water and Nixtamal. If there's nothing going in between those stones, you're gonna get an enormous amount of friction that's not only gonna wear down your stones faster, but it's gonna cause any masa that does come off, if there's any left over, to be kind of burnt, usually a little bit gray, off color, gummy. So I'm gonna transfer just a little bit of that rinsed Nixtamal over here. This is probably about, I don't know, 1.5 pounds, 2 pounds worth that we're working with at a time. You don't wanna overwhelm the hopper. So I'm gonna do just 1 or 2 pulses just to make sure it's pulling some of that, some of the Nixtamal into the auger, into the cavity of the stones. And then from there, we'll be able to use the tightening knob to calibrate and dial into what we're looking for. So I'm gonna engage our stone clutch lever here. It's now caused the stones to move closer together as I do that. And I'm gonna press the on button, just pulse it a couple times. We now have a little bit of Nixtamal building up so that the stones aren't directly pressing each other. And you can see we're looking for rapid moving snowflakes, and already we're off to a good start. We've got some snowflakes that are coming off of this. As I kind of rub the masa between my fingers, I'm not feeling any particles in it. We're actually pretty close to go. All right, so as I'm getting started, just again, make sure you have your water bottle in your hand or your trickle ready to go, your spatula in your other hand. You wanna be really careful that you're not sticking your fingers, directly in here. All right, let's get started. As the masa is coming off, we're looking for texture, again, making sure that there's really no particles detectable between your fingers. We're paying attention to the smell, the aroma. It should smell like something homey, fragrant, like the makings of a really delicious tortilla. In addition to that, you want to take a look at the color, make sure that you're not getting kind of bits of this gray volcanic rock into the masa. And at this point, it should feel warm in your hands. So the temperature of the masa that's coming off really should be between about 40 degrees and 60 degrees Celsius, depending on how close those stones are together. This is definitely warm to touch, and that's what you want. This was not hot corn to start with. It's sort of getting hotter as it's working off of the stones into masa. We've just finished grinding our masa, and it's ready to be mixed. This step is most crucial for texture control, so it's really the last stage before you're gonna start pressing and cooking your tortilla. It's definitely something you wanna do ideally with a machine that's gonna get you about 5 minutes of a consistent, even spin. What you're gonna be looking for is making sure that the masa is sufficiently wet. So maybe over the course of the last half hour as you're grinding the Nixtamal, it's gonna get a little bit drier. You wanna rehydrate that masa. In the case that it's too wet, you can actually add a little bit of masa harina to the masa to make sure that it's a little bit drier and balancing out that excess moisture. This is also where you can introduce seasoning. You can also add things like coloring if you want to do cilantro juice or beet juice. And if you were working in the industry, and you wanted to add preservatives or gums to it, you could do that here. So I've got my masa in here. I'm going to lock it into a stand-up mixer. All right. Make sure it's engaged. I'm going to slowly turn it on and gradually add a little bit of water. My masa started to dry out just a little bit. It's kind of starting to get a little flaky, a little crummy. So I want to make sure it's a little bit moist to touch. So now that it's mixing, I'm going to let this go for about 5 minutes. The idea is that we're going to incorporate some of those finer bits with the coarser bits and just make sure everything is uniform. Okay, we're finally at the point that we've all been waiting for, which is the pressing and the cooking of the tortilla. At this point, the proof is in the puff. We're either going to see if we're going to puff or not puff. Key to making a puff possible is making sure that there's enough moisture in the masa. So we've already done in that mixing step, we've done the moisture addition that we needed. You want to make sure that the surface temperature is hot enough. So this one is a griddle, it's an electric griddle. It's definitely not as hot as you can get at home. Right now, this is at 425. For the sake of what we're doing here in this kitchen, this should be plenty to get at least a mild puff. We also want to make sure that the texture is fine enough. If that texture is not right, and we haven't done that on the grind side, you're gonna have a really hard time. And last but not least, the compression. The compression has to be just tight enough to make sure that you're getting an even sear on both sides, and you can quickly expand that without overcooking it so that it cooks through the center. So this is actually a press that comes from Oaxaca. One of our partners, Doña Rosa, actually makes this. We really love this because it gets you a thin press on really the first try. I'm also using just recycled pieces of plastic here from a shopping bag. Really, the thinner the plastic, the better. So I'm gonna take a little bit of masa here. Usually you're measuring out about an ounce. I'm gonna do a quick roll between the palms of my hand, flatten it out with my fingers here so it gets an even head start. I'm gonna close this down. And I'm gonna do some force, but not too much. And you can see it's already gotten one consistent shape. It's already kind of circular. This isn't quite as thin as I want it, so I'm gonna make sure it's flipped over. And I'm gonna do it one more time. Very carefully remove that top layer. And I'm gonna let the gravity kind of do its work in my hand and gradually peel back as it's balanced on kind of the bottom 3 fingers of my hand. I'm gonna drape it over the plancha or the griddle or whatever your cooking surface is. Even in the time that this has been being prepared in the course of this shot, it's kind of already started to dry out a little bit. So I've always got this little spritzer next to me. This is an atomizer that's just gonna inject a little bit of moisture to make sure it's got enough to work with. Let's do like a quick little spray. We're gonna sear off on both sides. So one side, and we're gonna flip it back in its original side. That's when we're gonna start seeing the puff. It's when it's starting to actually cook through and it's not just searing on both sides. The composition of the surface has changed. It's got a little bit of a rougher texture because you can see it's started to dry out, but also cook. I'm gonna let the other side do it probably 30 seconds or so, depending on how hot your griddle is. The hotter the griddle, the less time you're gonna need to actually cook it. So I'm coaxing this along a little bit. Compression tends to be one of those last variables you can manipulate as you're cooking to make sure it's rising through the center. So in order to do that, I just apply a little bit of pressure on the outsides and you can start to see it starts to puff up. At this point, it started to cook through the center. I know that it's not gonna have a doughy, raw consistency on the inside because that steam, the steam is very evidently traveling through the tortilla. And we're pretty much good to go. I'm gonna let it sit for another 10 seconds to make sure it's really cooked through and on both sides. And that's it. So yeah, be careful when you take this off. They are super hot. You can see it's pretty white. And had we not washed the skins off as much, it would have been a little bit more yellow. It smells amazing. It starts to sort of that toasted aroma of corn that you've been blooming and developing since the cooking process is super evident right now. Take a bite. I like a little bit of crispiness on the outside, especially if you're working with a Oaxacan style tortilla. You want to have a little bit of crust with a kind of a molten center. Yeah. That's exactly what you're going for. Tortillas are best eaten right away. So right now, if I'm gonna be enjoying this within the next 5 to 10 minutes, I'm gonna store this in a kitchen towel or some kind of tortilla vessel that's gonna keep it warm. And if I'm not, I'm gonna let it stay open so that it cools down really quickly and doesn't develop condensation in the fridge. Once you do revive the tortilla later on, it's really helpful that one, you're using a griddle or whatever cooking surface that's just as hot as the one we started with. And you can really almost revive almost any dead tortilla that's not molding by just kind of spraying it with a little bit of water on the outside, getting it on that side. And you'll start to see it comes to life again. So you can even like rebind, cracked edges and things like that just with the introduction of moisture, because it kind of turns it into a masa for a second again before it cooks.